My name is Alexander Kovacs, but everyone just calls me Alex. From the third-floor window of my workshop in Portland, Oregon, I can see the mist rolling in from the west, blurring the edges of the city's bridges. The air in here is a sharp, clean cocktail of tanned hide, beeswax, and cedar. On the workbench before me lies a weekender bag, handcrafted from a single piece of Horween leather, its brass hardware gleaming softly in the afternoon light. A bag like this will sell for a small fortune to someone who understands that true quality is a quiet conversation between material and maker. I have a 6-month waiting list. I am, by all accounts, a success. But the smell that truly defines me isn't the fresh, expensive leather I work with now. It's a ghost scent, one that lives in the deepest parts of my memory, the smell of old leather, linseed oil, and my father's workshop in a cramped Philadelphia row house. That is where my story begins, not in this spacious, minimalist studio, but in a world of worn tools and unspoken love, a world I once believed would last forever. My father was a magician of leather. Our home was a classic Philly two-story, but the ground floor wasn't a living room. It was Kovacs Leather Repair. It was a neighborhood institution. People brought him their family's ancient luggage, their favorite boots worn through at the sole, their grandfather's cracked leather armchair. He could resurrect anything. He was a quiet man, my father. He spoke not with words, but with the rhythmic tap of his hammer, the steady pull of his awl, the focused whisper of a skiving knife thinning an edge. I was his shadow. From the time I was old enough to see over his workbench, I was there, breathing in the rich, earthy aromas, learning the difference between full grain and top grain, watching his strong, steady hands bring the dead back to life. If my father was the silent, skilled hands of the shop, my mother was its heart and voice. She ran the front counter, her warm laugh making every customer feel like a long-lost friend. She was the bridge between my father's quiet world of craft and the bustling city outside. She would bring him coffee, her hand resting on his shoulder for a moment, a silent exchange that seemed to power him through the day. Our little family was a perfect, self-contained ecosystem, our lives revolving around the rhythms of the shop. I believed, with the simple faith of a child, that the three of us, and the smell of old leather, were a permanent fixture in the universe. The universe, however, has other plans. When I was 12, a drunk driver ran a stop sign on a rain-slicked street. My mother, on her way home from the market, was gone in an instant. The crash didn't just take her life, it shattered the heart of our ecosystem. The cheerful bell above the shop door fell silent. My father locked it. He stopped taking new work. The light in his eyes, the one that sparked when he solved a difficult repair, went out. He would sit at his workbench for hours, holding a single tool, staring at nothing. The smell of the workshop, once a scent of creation and purpose, became the stale air of a tomb. His magic was gone. Without my mother as his audience and his connection to the world, the work became a joyless, mechanical act. He saw her ghost in every worn-out purse, her memory in every customer he no longer had the heart to face. His grief was a quiet, suffocating thing. It didn't rage, it simply consumed. A year after the accident, he sat me down in our silent living room above the silent shop. "Alex," he said, his voice rusty, "I can't do this anymore. I can't be a father to you. Not a real one." He told me he had sold the shop and the building. He was moving away, taking a simple job somewhere else. And I was going to live with my mother's sister, my Aunt Carol, and her husband in the suburbs. The next day, he drove me out of the city, away from the familiar grid of streets and the grid I called home. We pulled up to a neat house on a cul-de-sac with a perfectly manicured lawn. It felt like another planet. Before he left, he pulled something from the back of his car, his old canvas tool roll, heavy and lumpy. "You should have these," he said, pressing the roll into my hands. He couldn't look at me. He gave me a quick, awkward hug and got back in his car. I stood on that pristine suburban sidewalk, holding the tools of a trade that had defined my entire existence, and watched my father drive out of my life. In my new, sterile bedroom that night, I unrolled the canvas. The familiar smell of leather, oil, and my father's hands filled the air, a heartbreaking perfume from a world that had just been stolen from me. Life with my Aunt Carol and Uncle Mark was like living inside a snow globe. Everything was clean, orderly, and encased in a layer of impenetrable, placid glass. Their house in the Philadelphia suburbs was a landscape of beige carpets, muted floral wallpaper, and the faint chemical scent of air freshener. It was the polar opposite of the beautiful, chaotic symphony of my childhood home. There was no dust from sanded leather, no sharp tang of dye, no comforting heft of history in the air. There was only silence, a carefully curated quiet that felt louder and more oppressive than the city's constant roar. My aunt and uncle were kind people, in their own way. They were perpetually concerned with my adjustment. Aunt Carol would make me bland, healthy meals she found in magazines, and ask with anxious eyes if I was doing okay. Uncle Mark, a man who sold insurance and wore pleated khakis even on weekends, I would try to engage me in conversations about sports teams I didn't follow, or suggest I join the high school soccer team to get my mind off things. They treated my grief like a problem to be solved, a messy stain on their pristine carpet that needed to be scrubbed away with wholesome activities and positive thinking. They wanted me to forget. But my father's tool roll, which I kept hidden under my bed, was a constant, heavy reminder that forgetting was not an option. It was the only real thing I had left. School was a blur of anonymous hallways and faces I had no interest in knowing. I was the new kid, the city kid, the one with the tragic backstory that teachers spoke about in hushed tones in the faculty lounge. I ate lunch alone, finding refuge in the library. Not because I loved to read like my mother had, but because it was the one place where silence was expected. I felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that wasn't mine. My real life was in the memories stirred by the tools under my bed. At night, I would lock my door and unroll the canvas. I'd pick up a familiar tool, a stitching awl with a handle worn smooth by my father's palm, a heavy mallet with a perfectly balanced head, and just hold it, the cold steel a conduit to the past. The suburbs were a world of disposable things. When a shoe broke, you threw it away and bought a new one. When a belt frayed, it was replaced. The idea of repair, of breathing new life into a worn object, was alien here. It made me feel even more like a relic from another time. One afternoon, searching for a book in Uncle Mark's meticulously organized den, my eyes fell upon a thick, dust-jacketed volume on a lower shelf. American Artisans, A Legacy of Craft. I pulled it out. It was filled with stunning black and white photographs of men like my father and grandfather, glassblowers, weavers, and yes, leatherworkers. It profiled artisans from the early 20th century who had dedicated their lives to their craft, their workshops looking just like my father's, filled with the same beautiful clutter of creation. The book became my secret scripture. It showed me that my father's world wasn't just a strange, outdated family business. It was part of a noble American tradition. It gave his work a context and a dignity that my new suburban life was trying to erase. It planted a seed of defiance in me. I wasn't just the son of a failed shoe repairman. I was the heir to a legacy. The urge to create, to do something with my hands, became an unbearable itch. I found what I was looking for in the back of my closet. An old, cracked leather jacket I'd had since I was a boy, long since outgrown. It was a cheap thing, the leather thin and stiff. But it was a canvas. One Saturday, when my aunt and uncle were out for the day, I brought it to my room, locked the door, and unrolled my father's tools. My heart hammered in my chest. It felt like a transgression, a sacred rite. I laid the jacket on the floor and began. I used a stitch ripper to carefully take it apart, seam by seam. I used a skiving knife to thin the worn edges. I used a small bottle of conditioner I'd bought with my allowance to soften the brittle hide. My hands, clumsy at first, slowly began to remember. The muscle memory was there, buried deep. I wasn't just taking apart a jacket. I was dissecting my own past, trying to understand how it was all put together. I worked for weeks in secret, a few hours at a time whenever I was alone. I decided not to repair the jacket, but to transform it. Using the best panels of leather, I began to stitch together something new, a sturdy, hand-stitched dop kit. I had to improvise, punching holes with a nail and a hammer, using dental floss coated in wax for thread. It was crude. The stitches were uneven, the cuts not perfectly straight. But as it took shape, a flicker of the old magic returned. The smell of the conditioned leather, the satisfying pull of the thread, the solid feel of the tools in my hands. It was an anchor in the sterile, drifting sea of my new life. When it was finished, I held it in my hands. It was a clumsy, imperfect thing, but it was whole, and it was mine. I had made it. In the suffocating quiet of the suburbs, I had found my voice again, and it was the whisper of leather and thread. The small, imperfect dop kit I crafted in the silence of my bedroom was not an end, but a beginning. It was proof of concept. It proved that my hands still remembered the language my father had taught them, a language of tension and texture, of strength and suppleness. It proved that I could create something whole out of what was broken. That small victory ignited a quiet, clandestine rebellion within me. My life became a study in compartmentalization. By day, I was Alex, the quiet, unremarkable suburban high school student drifting through classes and hallways like a ghost. But by night, and on weekends when the house was empty, I was my father's son, a leather worker in a secret workshop. My bedroom became my sanctuary and my laboratory. I saved every dollar of my allowance, not for video games or movie tickets, but for supplies. I'd take the bus to a Tandy leather store in a strip mall miles away, a place that felt like a secret embassy from my home country. I'd walk the aisles, running my hands over the large hides, breathing in the intoxicating, chemical, and earth scent of a place dedicated to the craft. I bought small scraps of vegetable tanned leather, waxed thread in different weights, and a proper set of stitching punches. My father's tool roll was the heart of my operation, but I was slowly, carefully, building my own arsenal around it. My skills grew through trial and error, guided by the muscle memory of my childhood and the ghosts of my father's lessons. I deconstructed old belts from thrift stores to understand their construction. I practiced my stitching on scrap pieces for hours, my fingers growing calloused, until the lines were straight and the tension was perfect. I learned to burnish edges with beeswax and canvas until they were smooth and glossy. Each small success was a reclamation of my identity. The first test of my burgeoning skills came from a kid at school named Matt. He was a quiet, artsy type who always carried a battered, old leather satchel that had belonged to his grandfather. The main strap was tearing away from the body of the bag, the leather dry and cracked. He was lamenting that he'd have to retire it. On an impulse I didn't fully understand, I heard myself say, "I think I can fix that." He looked at me, surprised. I was the invisible kid. I didn't talk to anyone. "For real?" he asked. I nodded, a knot of fear and excitement tightening in my stomach. That night, I laid his bag on my floor. It was a beautiful piece, made from thick, durable bridal leather, something built to last. The damage was significant, but the bag's soul was intact. This was not a cheap, disposable thing. It was an heirloom, just like the furniture in the book from my uncle's den. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, I felt a profound sense of purpose. I wasn't just fixing a bag. I was honoring a tradition. I spent the entire weekend on it. I carefully removed the failing stitches, cleaned the old leather with saddle soap, and then conditioned it with mink oil, watching the dry, thirsty hide drink it in and return to a deep, rich brown. The most difficult part was reattaching the strap. The leather was too thick for my small punches. I had to use my father's awl, pressing down with all my weight to pierce the hide, my hands aching with the effort. I stitched it back on with heavy wax thread, using a saddle stitch, 2 needles working in tandem to create a seam far stronger than the original machine stitching. When I was done, I buffed the entire bag until it glowed with a soft luster. It wasn't just repaired, it was resurrected. When I gave the bag back to Matt at school on Monday, he was speechless. He ran his hand over the new stitches, his eyes wide. "Dude, how?" he asked. "It looks better than it did before." I just shrugged, but inside, a fire was burning. He insisted on paying me $20. It was the first money I had ever earned with my own 2 hands, with my father's tools. That $20 bill felt more valuable than anything I had ever owned. That small repair opened a secret channel. Matt told a friend who told another. Soon I had a small clandestine business running out of my bedroom. I repaired torn backpacks, patched leather jackets, and replaced broken straps on purses. It was my secret life, a world of craft and purpose hidden within the bland conformity of the suburbs. It was also my escape fund. The blueprint for that escape came from the internet. One night, falling down a rabbit hole of craft-related blogs, I discovered a world I never knew existed. I found websites for bespoke leatherworkers in New York City, London, and Tokyo. These weren't shoe repairmen. They were artisans, creating exquisite, minimalist bags, wallets, and briefcases that sold for thousands of dollars. Their workshops were clean, bright studios, their tools were objects of beauty, and their work was featured in magazines like GQ and Esquire. It was a revelation. It was as if I had been speaking a local dialect my whole life, and had just discovered it was part of a global, classical language. The craft wasn't dead. It hadn't been relegated to dusty repair shops. It had evolved. It had become art. And its capital, at least in America, was New York City. The idea took root and became an obsession. New York was where I needed to be. It was the only place I could see a future where I wasn't just a hobbyist hiding in his bedroom, but a true craftsman. I was 18, a month away from graduating high school. It was time. I chose my moment carefully, at the dinner table on a Sunday evening. "I'm not going to college," I announced, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm moving to New York after graduation. I'm going to be a leather worker." The silence that followed was heavy and immediate. Aunt Carol put her fork down, her face a mask of confusion. Uncle Mark cleared his throat. Alex, that's not a real career path, he said, his tone the one he used to explain complicated insurance policies. That's a hobby. A nice one, but not a job. Your father. Well, you saw how that ended. This is different, I insisted, my voice rising. People are making a living doing this. High-end, custom work. It's a real business. In New York? Aunt Carol said, her voice trembling slightly. But it's so expensive, and you don't know anyone. What would you do? Where would you live? I'll get a job in a restaurant, a coffee shop, anything. I'll save up. I'll find a workshop space, I argued, the plan sounding flimsier as I said it out loud. Absolutely not, Uncle Mark said, his voice firm now. We've already looked at the application for the community college. You can get a business degree. That's a sensible plan. This is a fantasy, Alex. It's irresponsible. The argument escalated. They saw my plan as a rejection of their care, of the stable, sensible world they had tried to give me. I saw their sensible plan as a life sentence in a beige prison. The final hurtful blow came from my aunt. Your father ran away from his responsibilities, she said, tears in her eyes. Don't you run away too. That was it. He ran away because he was broken. I shot back, standing up from the table, my chair scraping against the floor. I'm not running away. I'm running towards something. For the first time in 6 years, I know what I want to do, and I'm not going to let it die in this house. I left the room, the argument hanging unresolved in the air. There was no more discussion. The battle lines had been drawn. I spent the next month preparing for my departure, a silent soldier readying for war. I packed my few clothes into a duffel bag. I carefully cleaned and oiled every one of my father's tools, wrapping them securely in their canvas roll. It was my inheritance, my armor, my only real possession. The day after graduation, while my aunt and uncle were at work, I left a note on the kitchen counter. It was short. Thank you for everything. I'm sorry, but I have to do this. I took a bus to the 30th Street station in Philadelphia. Standing on the platform, waiting for the train to New York, the city's familiar grit felt like a welcome embrace. I was terrified. I had a few $100s from my secret repair business and a bag full of old tools. But as I stepped onto the train and it began to pull away from the station, leaving the suburbs and my borrowed life behind, I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated freedom. I was finally heading home, to a place I had never been. New York City in July is a furnace. The air is a thick, humid blanket that smells of hot asphalt, roasting peanuts, and a million strangers' sweat. It was into this furnace that I arrived, a 19-year-old with a duffel bag, a roll of antique tools, and a naive belief that sheer will was a form of currency. My first week was a brutal education. The money I'd saved, which had seemed like a small fortune in my suburban bedroom, evaporated with frightening speed. I found a room for rent in a fourth-floor walk-up in Astoria, Queens. It was a tiny space, barely big enough for the single mattress on the floor, and I shared the cramped apartment with 2 other guys who worked night shifts and communicated mostly through grunts and dirty dishes left in the sink. The romance of my escape quickly curdled into the grim reality of survival. My first job was as a busboy at a hectic 24-hour diner in Midtown. It was grueling, thankless work. I spent 10 hours a day on my feet, navigating a chaotic ballet of swinging kitchen doors, stressed-out waitresses, and demanding customers. I cleared half-eaten plates, wiped up spilled coffee, and hauled heavy tubs of dirty dishes back to the steamy, roaring inferno of the dishwashing station. I'd get home long after midnight, my body aching, and my clothes smelling of grease, and collapse onto my mattress. The sounds of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of the elevated train, my constant, restless lullaby. I was a ghost again, but this time, it was a different kind of invisibility. I wasn't the quiet kid in a placid suburb. I was just another anonymous cog in the city's relentless machine. The one thing that kept me sane was the tool roll. It remained under my mattress, a sacred object in my dingy room. Some nights, too exhausted to sleep, I would unroll it. The familiar weight of my father's mallet in my hand, the cool steel of a skiving knife against my palm. These things were my connection to a self that was rapidly being eroded by the daily grind. But I couldn't work. The apartment was too small, my roommates too present. The craft was a fire banked within me, with no oxygen to let it burn. After 2 months of this soul-crushing routine, I knew something had to change. I had saved a little money, and I started searching. I wasn't looking for a new apartment, but for a space to work. My search led me to the industrial fringes of Brooklyn, to a neighborhood called Bushwick. There, in a vast graffiti-covered warehouse that once housed a textile factory, I found a place called Brooklyn Makerspace. It was a communal workshop, a sprawling ecosystem of creativity. Welders threw sparks in one corner, ceramicists worked at pottery wheels in another, and woodworkers sent sawdust flying from humming table saws. The air was a chaotic but beautiful perfume of ozone, clay, and cut wood. It felt, in a strange way, like home. Renting a small, dedicated workbench there was a terrifying financial commitment. It would cost me nearly half of my monthly earnings from the diner. It was an irresponsible, reckless decision by any sensible measure. It was the most important decision I ever made. The first time I unrolled my father's tools on my own workbench, in my own rented space, I felt a sense of ownership and belonging that I hadn't felt since I was a child in his shop. This was mine. My life found a new, punishing rhythm. I'd work my shift at the diner, then take the long subway ride to Bushwick, often not arriving at the workshop until after 10 p.m. While the city slept, I worked. Fueled by cheap coffee and sheer determination, I began to create. I started small, using the scraps of leather I could afford. I made wallets with clean, minimalist lines, sturdy key fobs, and hand-stitched belts. This wasn't repair work. This was creation from scratch. I was developing my own aesthetic, a blend of my father's rugged durability and a clean, modern sensibility I was absorbing from the city around me. The workshop was my school and my church. I learned from watching the other makers, from the quiet advice of an old woodworker who saw the seriousness in my approach, from the endless process of trial and error. After 6 months, I had a small collection of finished goods. They were beautiful, I thought. The stitching was perfect, the edges were burnished to a high gloss, the designs were clean and functional. But they were sitting on my workbench, unseen. I needed to find a way to sell them. My first attempt was at a weekend street fair in my own neighborhood in Astoria. I paid for a small table, laid out my wallets and belts on a black cloth, and waited. People streamed past, their eyes scanning for food trucks, cheap sunglasses, or tie-dyed t-shirts. My small, quiet display of craftsmanship was utterly invisible. A few people picked up a wallet, whistled at the price I quoted, and put it down. "I can get a leather wallet for $20 at Target," one man said with a shrug. I didn't sell a single item all day. I packed up my work, my heart heavy with a familiar sense of failure, and rode the subway home in defeat. The next weekend, I tried again, this time at one of the more curated high-end markets, Artists and Fleas in Williamsburg. The crowd here was different, more attuned to design, more appreciative of handmade goods, but the competition was also fierce. I was surrounded by stunning jewelry, screen-printed posters, and vintage clothing. My small table still felt inadequate. I made a few small sales, enough to cover the cost of the table and my subway fare, but it was a far cry from a sustainable business. The dream of being a full-time craftsman felt impossibly distant. The breakthrough came on a cold, gray Sunday, just as I was starting to lose hope. A woman stopped at my table. She was older, perhaps in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of effortless authority. She wasn't just browsing, she was inspecting. She picked up one of my belts, bending it, feeling the weight of the leather, examining the solid brass buckle. She ran a single, critical finger along the line of my hand stitching. "This is a saddle stitch," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was low and precise. "Yes, ma'am," I said, my own voice suddenly feeling young and uncertain. "2 needles by hand. It's stronger than a machine lock stitch," she continued, her eyes still on the belt. "The edges are burnished, not painted. The leather is full grain, vegetable tanned. Where did you learn to do this?" I found myself telling her everything. About my father, his shop in Philadelphia, the tools, the suburbs, the diner. I told her my story. She listened without interruption, her gaze never leaving my face. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. "Craft without a story is just a product," she said finally. "You have both. My name is Julianne Moore. I'm a creative director for a men's luxury brand. We're developing a new line of high-end accessories, a heritage collection. We've been looking for authentic American craftsmen to collaborate with, not factories but individuals." She handed me her business card. The cardstock was thick and expensive, the font clean and elegant. "I'm not going to buy this belt," she said, placing it carefully back on the table, "because I want you to make a dozen of them for me, along with a collection of wallets and card holders. I want you to bring your tools and your story to my office on Monday. We'll talk about a contract. I stood there, stunned into silence, holding her card. It felt heavier and more valuable than any tool in my role. She gave me a small, knowing smile. "Don't look so surprised," she said. "Talent and desperation. It's the engine of this city. I know it when I see it." She turned and disappeared into the Brooklyn crowd, leaving me standing at my small table, the entire world having just cracked open. Walking into the corporate headquarters of the luxury brand on Monday morning was like stepping through a portal into another dimension. The lobby was a cathedral of white marble and glass, silent except for the hushed clicks of keyboards from a minimalist reception desk. The air smelled of expensive perfume and money. It was a world away from the sweat, sawdust, and turpentine of the Brooklyn makerspace. I felt like an imposter, my worn work boots suddenly feeling clumsy and loud on the polished floor, the heavy tool roll in my hand a piece of alien technology from another world. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, primitive rhythm completely out of sync with the serene, calculated environment. Julianne Moore met me herself, not in a sterile conference room, but in her own office, a bright, airy space with a stunning view of Central Park. One wall was covered in corkboard, pinned with fabric swatches, leather samples, and sketches. It was a working office, not a showroom, and that small detail put me slightly at ease. She didn't waste time with small talk. She had my pieces from the market laid out on her large desk, next to professional-looking design mock-ups. "As I said, we want to collaborate," she began, her voice crisp and direct. "We don't just want to buy your products and put our label on them. That's not the story. The story is you. It's your father's shop. It's these tools." She gestured to the canvas roll I had placed on the floor. "We want to launch a capsule collection, the Kovacs collection by brand name. We'll feature you, your workshop, your story. We'll build the entire marketing campaign around the idea of authentic American heritage, of a craft passed down from father to son." I stared at her, the words taking a moment to land. Father to son. The phrase was a punch to the gut. The craft hadn't been passed down in a loving Rockwellian scene. It had been abandoned, left in a dusty roll on a suburban sidewalk. My skills weren't a gift, they were an act of salvage, of defiance. My story, as she called it, was a private, painful thing. The idea of it being polished up and used to sell $1,000 bags felt like a profound violation. "My father." "We're not in touch," I said, the words tasting like ash. "He doesn't do this anymore." Julianne waved a dismissive hand, as if swatting away an irrelevant detail. "That's even better," she said, a flicker of excitement in her eyes. "It's more romantic. The sun picking up the fallen mantle. The last of his line. It's a powerful narrative." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. She wasn't seeing me. She was seeing a character, a brand identity. But what choice did I have? This was the opportunity of a lifetime, the only real path out of the diner and into the life I dreamed of. To refuse would be to condemn myself to more years of exhaustion and obscurity. To accept felt like selling a piece of my soul. I thought of the long nights in the workshop, the smell of grease on my clothes, the constant gnawing anxiety about rent. "Okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'll do it." The contract was overwhelming, a thick document full of legal jargon. But the numbers were life-changing. The advance alone was more money than I had ever seen in my life. It was enough to quit my job, pay for my workshop space for a year, and buy the highest quality leather in bulk. It was the key to the cage. I signed it. The next 3 months were a blur of focused, relentless work. The first thing I did was walk into the diner and quit. The look on my manager's face, a mixture of shock and annoyance, was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. From that day on, the workshop was my entire world. I was there from sunrise until long after midnight. My life shrank to the four walls of my workspace, to the smell of leather and wax, to the steady rhythm of my own hands. The pressure was immense. I wasn't just making a few pieces for a market stall. I was creating a full production run for a luxury brand. Every stitch had to be perfect. Every edge had to be flawless. Every piece had to live up to the story Julianne was crafting around me. A photographer came to the workshop, shooting me with my father's tools, his lens turning my gritty, authentic workspace into a romantic, artfully lit tableau. I hated it, but I played the part. Despite the pressure, there was also a deep, profound joy. For the first time, I was a full-time craftsman. I could afford to work with the best materials in the world: leather from the Horween Tannery in Chicago, solid brass hardware from a small foundry in England. I was living the life I had only read about in my uncle's book. I was exhausted, but it was a clean, satisfying exhaustion, born of purpose, not of drudgery. I I was building something real. The collection was set to launch for the holiday season. A few niche men's-style blogs began to run preliminary features on the collaboration, using the photographer's romantic shots. They mentioned my name, Alexander Kovacs, and the narrative Julianne had crafted, the young artisan reviving his father's lost craft in a Brooklyn workshop. I was in the workshop late one Tuesday night, putting the finishing touches on the last batch of briefcases, when I heard a hesitant knock on the large, rolling door of my studio space. It was unusual. No one ever came by this late. I slid the heavy door open and my heart stopped. Standing there, under the harsh industrial lights of the hallway, was my father. He looked older, more worn than I remembered. His hair was thinner, streaked with more gray. He was holding a crumpled, printed-out page from a blog, my face staring up from it. He looked from the picture to me, then past me, into the workshop. He saw the stacks of beautiful leather, the finished bags gleaming on the shelves, the familiar shapes of his own tools laid out neatly on my workbench. His eyes, the same eyes that had been so empty and lifeless when he left me, were now wide with a complex, unreadable emotion. "Alex?" he said, his voice a rough, broken sound. They said you were doing my work." All the air went out of my lungs. The anger I had kept carefully banked for 7 years roared to life, hot and blinding. All the lonely nights, all the struggles, all the quiet shame of his abandonment, it all coalesced into a single burning point of rage. "Your work?" I said, my voice shaking with it. "You haven't done this work in a decade. You threw it away. You threw me away with it. This isn't your work. It's mine. I built this, with the tools you didn't even want." He flinched as if I had physically struck him. "I know," he whispered, his gaze falling to the concrete floor. "I know. I saw the name. Kovacs. I had to see. I didn't think it was real." "It's real," I said, my voice cold as steel. "No thanks to you." "I was broken, Alex," he said, finally looking at me, and in his eyes, I saw not a monster, but a man hollowed out by grief. "When your mother died, the light of the whole world went out. Everything turned to ash. The tools felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. And you looked so much like her. Every time I looked at you, it was like a knife in my heart. I know it was wrong. It was a coward's way out. But I didn't know how else to survive. I'm not here to ask for anything. I had to see." His confession didn't soften me. It enraged me further. It was a story, an excuse, and my own story was currently being exploited for a marketing campaign. I had no room for his. "You had to see?" I shot back. "Fine. You've seen it. Now you can go." I didn't wait for a reply. I slid the heavy workshop door shut, the sound of it booming in the sudden silence. I leaned my back against the cold steel, my legs trembling, my heart pounding a wild, painful rhythm. I had won. I had faced the ghost of my past and banished him. But as I stood alone in my beautiful, successful workshop, surrounded by the evidence of everything I had accomplished, I had never felt more like a broken, abandoned child. Chắc chắn rồi. Đây là chương cuối cùng, chương 6 của câu chuyện. Chapter 6. The Grain of the Future. The heavy steel door of the workshop did little to shut out the ghost I had just banished. My father's presence lingered in the air, more potent in his absence than he had been in person. I spent the rest of that night in a state of agitated paralysis. I tried to work, to lose myself in the familiar, soothing rhythm of stitching, but my hands felt like they belonged to someone else. The tools felt foreign. Every tap of the mallet echoed the finality of the door sliding shut. I had won. I had stood in the fortress I had built and turned away the man who had left me in the wilderness. The victory was as hollow and bitter as ash in my mouth. The story Julianne Moore was selling, the son picking up the fallen mantle, was a lie. The truth was uglier. The son had picked up the mantle only to use it as a weapon against the father who had dropped it. The Kovacs collection launched 2 weeks later, with a lavish party at the brand's flagship Soho store. The place was packed with fashion editors, influencers, and the kind of wealthy, beautiful people who seemed to populate this new world I found myself in. A section of the store had been transformed into a romanticized version of my workshop, complete with artfully distressed wood panels and my own tools displayed in a glass case like holy relics. My photograph, a brooding black and white shot of me at my workbench, was blown up to the size of a wall. I stood beside it, wearing a ridiculously expensive shirt they had given me, smiling until my face ached, shaking hands, and repeating my well-rehearsed, sanitized story. The collection was an immediate, runaway success. It sold out online within hours. Articles appeared in Esquire and the Wall Street Journal, praising the line's authentic narrative and commitment to American heritage. My name, Alexander Kovacs, was attached to words like integrity, legacy, and craftsmanship. I was the living embodiment of a story I knew to be a carefully constructed fiction. The money that poured into my bank account was staggering. It was enough to secure my workshop for years, to hire apprentices, to buy any tool or hide I could ever want. It was everything I had dreamed of, in my lonely suburban bedroom and my greasy diner uniform. And I had never felt more like a fraud. The hollowness I felt after seeing my father didn't fade. It grew, expanding in the silence of my workshop after the parties and interviews were over. The joy of the work was tainted. Every time I picked up my father's old skiving knife, I didn't just feel the worn handle. I felt the weight of my last words to him. I had built my entire identity on the foundation of his abandonment, fueling my ambition with a righteous anger. Now, having confronted him, the anger had nowhere to go. The fire had burned out, leaving only the cold emptiness of a success that felt unearned because its very premise was dishonest. One night, unable to work, I found myself rummaging through the old tool roll, not for a tool, but for something else. Tucked into a small side pocket, I found something I had forgotten was there. A small, worn leather key fob. It was one of the first things my father had ever let me help him make for my mother. I remembered her laughing as I, a boy of 7, struggled to stamp her initial E onto the leather, striking it crookedly. My father had fixed it, his large hand gently guiding mine. He had stitched it with a bright red thread because he knew it was her favorite color. She had kept it on her keychain until the day she died. Holding that small, insignificant object, a different story pushed through the cracks of the one I had been telling myself for years. It wasn't a story of abandonment and anger. It was a story of a quiet man teaching his son, of a loving husband making a small gift for his wife, of a family held together by the simple, beautiful things they made. Before my father was the man who broke, he was the man who built. He was the man who had loved my mother so completely that her loss had shattered his world. My anger had been a shield, protecting me from the more complicated, painful truth. That his leaving wasn't just about me. It was about a grief so vast it had swallowed him whole. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. This wasn't about forgiveness. I wasn't sure I was capable of that. It was about truth. It was about reclaiming my own story from the marketing department. I took the day off from the workshop for the first time in months. I went back to the boarding house where I had found him, but he was gone. The landlord said he'd left the day after he had come to see me. My heart sank. But I was my father's son in more ways than one. I was stubborn and methodical. I spent the next 2 days making calls, checking records, following a cold trail. I finally found him working as a handyman for a cheap motel off a highway in New Jersey. I drove there in the late afternoon. I found him in the parking lot, methodically fixing the lock on one of the motel room doors. He was using a simple screwdriver, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked up as I approached, and I saw not fear or anger in his eyes, but a deep, weary resignation. We didn't talk about the confrontation at the workshop. We didn't talk about the past at all. I just stood there and watched him work for a moment. "The lock set is stripped," he said finally, his voice low. "It's cheap junk. It needs to be replaced, not repaired." "I'm hiring apprentices at the workshop," I said, the words coming out before I had fully formed them. "I need someone to teach them the basics. How to sharpen tools, how to skive an edge, how to tell good leather from bad. I can't do it all myself." He stopped working and looked at me, really looked at me, a flicker of confusion in his tired eyes. "Why would you ask me?" "Because you're the best I've ever seen," I said, and it was the truest thing I had said in months. "The money is good. It's a real job. No stories, no marketing, just the work." He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, a screwdriver in his hand, a broken man being offered a piece of the world he had thrown away. Finally, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. My story ends and begins again in the workshop. My father is there now, most days. He has his own workbench in the corner. He's quiet, and he keeps to himself. He and I don't have long, heartfelt conversations. We don't talk about my mother. We don't talk about the years we lost. We talk about the work. We talk about the angle of a blade, the tension of a thread, the character of a particular hide. He is a phenomenal teacher to the young apprentices I've hired, his patience endless, his knowledge bottomless. The Kovacs collection is still selling, but the name on the label feels different to me now. It's not just my name anymore. It's our name. It's complicated, and it's messy, and it's real. My journey was never about building a brand or proving my father wrong. It was about finding my way back to the workbench. I learned that you can't erase the scars and fractures in the material of your life. But if you are patient, and if you are honest, you can work with them. You can sand them down, incorporate them into the design, and build something new. Not something perfect, but something strong. Something that will last.